So I called this session, or what I was going to talk about, the plane of assertion and the least event. And really it was about, or really I got interested in this, what looks like an equation, the famous 01-10, or sometimes it's written as 0h0, which looks like an equation, but it's a diagram, and we might not get into this, but I also think it's a sigil, which I guess John Latham would really hate, but it's a sigil in that it's condensed information that represents a very important concept for Latham. I don't really know how to read this, but I found this in the archive, and it looks like he's working out this figure. And the noughts are kind of interesting because he's trying to count nothing there, as far as I can see. So the 0110 relates to this time-based spectrum, as I understand it. And the time-based spectrum has a M in the middle, which is, it seems to be the point where time and space starts. A would be the very beginnings of the universe, or possibly nothing before there's an event. P seems to be when humans arrive on the scene, and Q, R, and S seem to be where evolution has happened and we can be rational, instinctive, and intuitive. U seems to be the end of the universe, with Z interestingly being some unknown cosmic recurrence, suggesting that the whole thing is a loop. So I first of all tried to get to grips with this by drawing this, which is, I guess, a series of dots, a kind of, I guess, grain of some kind, representing probably particles, but then becoming something, planets, humans, whatever, black holes, and then dissipating, which actually works as a model of the universe, as most people understand it, both sort of standard, I think, and non-standard. So I guess eventually, or at some point, I try and talk about this, which is how I moved on, where I tried to kind of put together Latham and John Wheeler and Roger Penrose's diagrams and ideas about the universe. So I was very interested in this artwork by Latham, which is a proto-universe, and I guess this is the 0 and the 1. That's my understanding of it. The glass being nothing, although that's questionable what is nothing, and the 1 being this blank canvas, which either my computer screen is dirty or there's a little dot on it. There. I'll have to ask Gareth for an inquiry into that one. So it's interesting, it's called a proto-universe, so it's not quite a universe. And the least event is basically this white canvas, which is a proton, basically, Latham says. And this is the story of Rio, which is quite a large work. It has the proto-universe at the beginning, it seems to me. So the way I read this is in relation to the 0 and the 1 and the 1 and the 0, is we got like the glass, which is the 0. Then maybe we have some proto-universes, which are these blank canvases, which again seem to have something on them, but I think that really is the dirt of my computer screen. Then you have another nothing, but then you have, it seems, an event of some kind, a proton, and the proto-universe becomes something. And Latham's idea, I think, is that that the universe is not made up of permanent things, or permanence isn't related to solid objects. Any appearance of permanence is due to a series of structured events, the planet Earth being, I think, a sort of singular or unique structure of events. I guess that relates very strongly to the idea of the quantum. And as you go on to the story of Rio, when you get around the corner, there are these big things like books, as you'd expect from Latham, which I guess could be planets or stars or humans or even black holes. And there's another piece, the Nu Nidri heart. This is only a small section of it, but it's a series of glass vitrines with objects and books in it, which are meant to be laid out like this. So this is a diagram from the archive, which shows a circularity or a looping. So 0, 1, 1, 0, I think why it might be a sigil is it kind of captures and condenses this idea in a figure or an image. But it also means that it's a diagram, I think, and that you read it from left to right, but you can also read it from right to left. So I put this in because I found this quite interesting. This was in the archive, so some of you might have seen this, where Latham has this idea about humans, it seems, as being kind of animal instinct, having reason, being able to kind of rationally work things out, but then operating at a kind of non-rational, non-verbal, intuitive level, if I understand it rightly, to understand time. And in this diagram you get this green wave, which is the wave of the non-verbal and the non-rational. And I guess that all happens in the 1 to 0 part. So I'm not watching the time, but I'll carry on. So the second part of the title, which plane of assertion, which is something that we've all talked about before, to me strongly related to what Latham was up to. So we've talked a lot about Peirce, C.S. Peirce, and about this idea of the themic sheet. So what we know is that Peirce wanted to make these existential graphs, which are diagrams where you get a piece of paper which is patterned or coloured on one side and maybe white or another colour on the other side, and you cut a shape out and reverse it, and what you've done is you've made a thing in a universe. And he calls this sheet of paper that you do the cutting out on, as I understand it, I think this is right, the themic sheet. So themic sheet really refers to a sheet in which you get Latin and Greek written on it. So I guess that's kind of like a sheet which has multiple languages. And the existential graphs were, as we've discussed before, Peirce's way of trying to make something visual rather than writing algebra or mathematical formula to describe logical relations. And I think importantly, as we got this from John, the themic sheet is a clearing. So I think I've looked back, I think I've called the themic sheet the sheet of assertion. But what Peirce says is this themic sheet is where you make an assertion and affirm something. And the themic sheet is also a space in where you clear a ground to make this first mark, which to me is strongly related to the kind of sheet of glass, the blank canvas, and then the first kind of spray or the 1 second drawing that Latham makes. And so I guess you can call this clearing a kind of dwelling for thought, because the clearing was also the idea of the space that you make to create a place to live, which like people make clearings for villages, I guess, or cities. There is a difference though between Latham, Peirce, and also another person we've spoken about, Jules Châtelet. So to kind of understand that a bit more, and it's quite interesting doing this. I made one of Peirce's diagrams following his instructions. I think he must have just laid the sheets down on the table, because obviously when you cut a hole out and reverse it, the thing falls out of the sheet. So, but I didn't do such a good job, but I used masking tape to fix mine in. And this is just a diagram, I think, of like a logical proposition of humans are animals, animals are mortal, and then you just keep going and reducing down till eventually you get human is an animal is immortal, and the last diagram is human is mortal. But the yellow shape is the cutting out from the sheet of assertion, which is the universe, which I guess you could think of as some kind of a continuum. And the yellow shape is a human, I think, and then the animal and the mortal are its relations or its properties. So what's interesting about this is that there's no time in it in the way that there is in Latham's diagrams, although there is something temporal, which is mortality in it, but that's just like a thing. It's got no kind of temporal description. I guess what I was thinking was that Peirce's diagram might be considered poor in some sense, which is what Châtelet thinks. But whether you can do this kind of work with Latham's diagram or Latham's approach is also questionable. If Peirce
could I jump in there?
Yeah.
Just to, although you're right that this diagram doesn't describe a temporal process. It absolutely is temporal, isn't it? In the sense, it kind of makes the kind of logic, which is being presented as a fact, as a matter of fact, in the sense that you've asserted it on the sheet. It turns it into a kind of temporal process, which is one of the things that diagrams do through the use of space, because as soon as something is spatialized, then we can kind of enter into that and go through things step by step or move things around in time. So that it's quite interesting in that sense. I mean, it might not be exactly what you're interested in, but
no, I am. I can't quite get my head around it. That's the thing.
Yeah. Okay, I just wanted to make that point, and I'll let you carry on.
No, that's interesting, because it is where I'm kind of going, which is
right.
So one of the big problems and debates, it seems, in science is what is fundamental or foundational to the universe. Is it space or is it time? And so there's a disagreement about that, which I can go into. But it's also curious what you're saying, because it's absolutely right that the diagram is a kind of temporal thing, isn't it? Because we, even explaining that diagram, I went through a process. And there's also the way space, if I understand you rightly, Dean, laying out in space allows that time sequence or temporal sequence, which is kind of thought, suggests that thought is a temporal, time-based thing as well.
Well, yeah, and all, to add to that, I mean, I guess the kind of the spatialization of time is one of the fundamental kind of principles and kind of uses of a diagram, but that in itself is very much to do with how we the kind of language we use to talk about time, which is always kind of spatialized. So we think of time as a line. So time is always given a spatial metaphor. It's like the only way that we can kind of understand it. So we'll talk about something that happened before or happened afterwards. These are spatial metaphors, and I think what Peirce is doing here is he's not describing a time, but he's involved in a temporal process. So the diagram is an index of a temporal process, whether that's him thinking through the thing, which is kind of literalized in his instructions of how to construct one of these things by drawing the lines around them to negate certain statements and then cutting them out and turning them over. It's a very kind of physical process. And then, of course, it takes us time to go through it and to figure out what it stands for.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. I mean, I've been concentrating on what he's representing. I mean, what I think is interesting in relation to Latham is that Latham wouldn't see the human as this kind of thing in the universe. I guess Latham would say that there's a structure of events, and also there's no universal time. There's just this kind of relative time. It just appears like that. I don't know enough about Peirce. I know he was really smart and well read and understood physics to an extent.
Can I throw a curveball in?
Yeah.
Okay, the concept of clearing and clearing a space for being is Heideggerian. And I just kind of like the idea that this might be a map of a territory of division in space between animals and humans, and also conceptually, because obviously in the Enlightenment, understanding the relationship between the difference between humans and animals and mortality and brutes was kind of a crucial philosophical problem. So I just like the idea that the plaster, the elastoplast shape, is a little bit like a plane of assertion in a field of wilderness, wildness. That you carve a clearing out, and within that clearing, you partition spaces for. So I'm literally turning it into a kind of a map of a territory between the human and the animal and the mortal. That the human might actually be distinguished from the mortal by the mortal animal by this interesting dotted line, which might be a kind of strange territorial line between, thinking through the difference between the human and the animal, where the animals are kept, whether the animals are kept in the house, whether they're kept in the field. And it also makes me think about mortality in graveyards and religion and like where humans put their dead. So I just wanted to throw that out, that this is also a map of a territory in a certain way, in terms of the clearing of human dwelling.
I think that's how I understand these diagrams to an extent. And I think it's clear that the human and the animal are distinguished, and to do that you have to draw a boundary, which, as you say, is really territorial.
It's a loose boundary. It's a porous boundary because we know we are animals, but we also know we're other than animals. We share with animals mortality. I suppose consciousness of mortality is historically and for the Enlightenment an important distinguishing feature between assumptions about animal consciousness and human consciousness. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, that it is
that's kind of relates to the topology of it, and also set theory, I guess, where you have a set where you have like A is the set of, and then it gives you like B, C, D, E, and you have to put that in brackets, so you've kind of already made a kind of space. And I think that this is actually Peirce's version of that. So I think that's really interesting because it's a temporal process, but it's also a kind of making of boundaries and territories. I've got another diagram which is interesting to look at in relation to this, which is a kind of a bit of a sort of bastardization of something by Chatelet, who we've discussed, who's really critical of set theory and topology, and introduces this idea of perspective, which Chatelet says, perspective can be a cliche, and also you have this vanishing point, and you become beholden to it. This is a diagram of velocity, and velocity. I looked this up so I could get it right, but velocity is basically the change of something through time and through measured time. So these squares could be counted as just one thing, or these rectangles would be counted as one thing, and each division could be like a second or something, or Planck time or whatever. And for Chatelet, he says, like velocity implies that there's going to be a vanishing point or a perspective. If I've put this I down the bottom, which I've actually got from John Wheeler, but in Chatelet's diagrams, some of them, he seems to be interested in putting where the observer participant is. But you could also kind of see this as the quite kind of Deleuzian Spinozist diagram. You could turn it into that, which Chatelet was, as we know, is like a good friend of Deleuze and was interested in Deleuze. But you could see this as one thing changing over time. So instead of velocity, you could see the thing changes in time, or it could be the vanishing point is the past, or the vanishing point is the future.
David, can I just ask, because what I'm also reminded of as you're speaking is film frames, cinema frames.
Yeah.
And the fact that, obviously every one of those could be a still frame in a film. And when run together consequentially, it creates an illusion of motion, and movement in time. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about Deleuze's thoughts on cinema relative to this kind of diagram.
The time image. I haven't really. That's such a complex thing to need a Deleuze expert in here. I mean, I got a more Latham reference, which is that in the diagram 0110 with the dash, if the middle is marked with M, which is where time and space starts, I think Latham actually suggests in his notes that cinema understood this like 30 frames per second, or so. Yeah, I think the film reference is also kind of interesting. But the important thing is that Chatelet says that diagrams like the Peirce set theory diagram is poor because it just presents this kind of thing that Latham would say is thought to be permanent and exist, not in time. But what also is interesting is Chatelet introduced this perspective point where everything condenses, and you can't see it, you can't have knowledge of it. There's a kind of horizon limit, which he says that if you imagined it as a kind of photon moving through a vector, that's where the Einstein put himself right on that vanishing point.
Can I ask another point, David, quickly, just about this, because I'm just very conscious of. Yesterday, I was trying to explain 1, 2, and 3 dimensions to my first year fine art students, and they weren't concepts that they were familiar with. And the point I did a rough sketch where I said, okay, here's a 2-dimensional figure, with height and width, and I'm going to draw a horizon line on it and put a point on that horizon line, which would be in illusionistic space a vanishing point, so it creates an illusion of depth. But so that's kind of like your diagram. But that point on the horizon line is still a zero-dimensional point on a one-dimensional line, right? Is that close to where we're going with this?
Yeah, except for Chatelet, that point is also time and space, but it's just not accessible to us. So,
David?
Yeah.
What's beyond the horizon, this dotted horizon? When we were discussing Chatelet before, were we saying that it was something to do with the imagination?
I think for Chatelet, it's let's think about that. Well, for Chatelet, this is velocity. So it's just that beyond that horizon, I think the particle or whatever it is continues. But also, it's like John Wheeler said about his diagrams, and what Faye Dorker kind of tries to do, I think, who's also an astrophysicist, tries to get you to imagine something and relate it to gravity. That these things don't actually represent anything necessarily. They're meant to, like Wheeler says, his diagrams are often just to allow thought to happen. But he's quite clear in saying, look, they don't represent you can't use a diagram to present an equation or the result of an experiment. Although he does have a diagram of the famous particle experiment. So for Chatelet, it's almost like a kind of, unfortunately, I'm going to say it's almost like a metaphor, although he says diagrams are better than metaphors. But he kind of thinks that you have to establish limit points or horizon points to actually go to them. That's one understanding I have of how he articulates perspective. And diagrams allow you to do that, I guess, because you can kind of be Einstein and sit on that photon as it's going through space.
I mean, Chatelet is. I mean, he's doing something very, very. I mean, his interest is somewhere completely different from Peirce in terms of diagramming, because Peirce is not diagramming space. Peirce is diagramming, is spatializing, logical propositions. Whereas Chatelet's book is called Figuring Space, and it's all about, as far as I can understand, it's all about kind of materializing space, or materializing the virtual as he would see it. So it's a kind of combination of kind of analogies that allow you to kind of project yourself into the kind of materiality of something which might otherwise be kind of rendered in a very kind of cold, rational way through ideas of measurement on rulers and so on. So he's actually trying to he's thinking about the way that diagrams, instead of a kind of, let's say, a kind of more common understanding of diagrams as giving us a distance, a kind of synoptic view over something kind of complicated. He talks, and he does it, and it's incredible to read his book, because it's he kind of enters into the kind of development of scientific thought and scientific theories through the kind of the diagrams and the analogies, which allow these scientists, through thought experiments or through imagining themselves, and then how that relates to the kind of drawings they do, to kind of transform space into something else, and particularly to to kind of penetrate it in a way. This is what he's interested in. So I mean, it seems that this diagram that you're showing is exactly what I was talking about before, in the sense that the interval is a way of spatializing time, but it does it in a dynamic way where we're not getting a kind of these things. We understand, what perspective does is it allows us to understand that these differently sized things and these differently positioned things are kind of homogeneous in a sense. We understand that the one at the on the horizon is exactly the same size as the one where we're standing, except that what it's doing as something.
Well, we don't know that. But
we don't know that, but
it's an inference.
We infer it from kind of conventions, particularly conventions of Renaissance painting, right? But unlike the kind of Cartesian grids, we're given a position. We're very much positioned in. So we're kind of we're brought into this space.
Well, the thing that Chatelet develops is what he calls spatial dialectics. I think you're right. What he is interested in is space and mass has virtual states, which he kind of explains just as like water can become steam or ice. And I think his criticism of the Peirce type diagrams would be that the plane of assertion, in Peirce's terms, the plane of assertion or the clearing would just be numbered as like human, not human, 1, 2. And we know from Peirce's first, second, thirdness that that what he's interested in is the third thing, which is the relation. But you're right, Chatelet's not interested in those kind of relations. He's more interested in the fact that the mass, like the one thing, is multiple and can be many things. And I guess it's a question as to whether what Peirce is dealing with is language rather than actual reality. But that's not kind of problem.
The broader theory, which is really important to bear in mind with Peirce and why he's so interesting and why he's really picked up by semiotics and so on, is that there's a role for the interpretant, right? So the interpretant is the kind of response, and that response does not have to be a cognitive response. That response to the sign, let's say the response to a diagram is a sign. It's a kind of second order firstness in the sense that it's an icon of relations, but it's there's the sign, but then there's the interpretation by the interpretant, which might as well be a feeling or an emotion, or some kind of energetic impulse or something, as much as a kind of cognitive response. So I think Peirce is actually very much a kind of very interested in this kind of materiality, but it's somewhere else down the line. It doesn't exist on the realm of that diagram itself. It's only when you bring the diagram into the world and introduce the interpretant that it becomes a kind of physical thing. I mean, that's how I would see it.
I think Chatelet just has a different purpose, which is that the idea of the spatial dialectic is that you have different possibilities in balance, and you use your diagram, or you think about matter, and you go towards these different virtual potentials. He sort of says that you kind of rush towards one or the other, in the same way that water might become ice or steam. But Chatelet's world.
Can I show you?
But just to say, Chatelet's world doesn't allow for the world of Peirce. Yeah, I'll quit.
Could I just show you a Chatelet?
Yeah.
Something Chatelet taught, because it's just relevant to this point, and then
I'm going to stop sharing.
Shut up.
No, don't shut up.
Hang on.
Dean, if you shut up, you're not going to get paid.
Oh shit! Yeah, I forgot about that. That's very important. Hang on.
Can I ask a question while you're finding it, Dean?
Yeah.
If it doesn't distract you too much. This is for maybe people who are watching who, like me, aren't entirely sure what either Peirce or Chatelet mean by the virtual, because most people understand the virtual to be virtual reality, and I do know something about the history of the philosophical concept of the virtual and the digital notion of virtual reality, but I think that might not be self-evident. So, without leading on this, it seems that the virtual reality, which is constructed through any form of screen, digital screen, is different from the virtual that you're talking about philosophically, or is it?
I think with Chatelet, at certain times it's very simple. There's like mass, which can change in volume and density when it's actualized or in its actual state, and mass has virtual potential to be a star or a black hole, or
so it's its potential to become something other than it, to change.
Well, the mass itself is all these potential states, I guess. That's my understanding of it. I mean,
so the virtual is the potential states it could be in.
I think so, yeah. But it's very material. It's not like the sun will turn into a rabbit, which might be more Deleuzian. Sorry, no, I take that back. But I mean, I find myself really at my limits all the time here, like with the physics, and I find it really incredibly exciting. But with the Peirce and the Chatelet, I find myself at my limits of understanding. But I think that's it. I think that for Chatelet, certainly in relation to what I was talking about, the virtual is simply this sort of potential or becoming of some other state.
The same for you, Dean. Is that, sorry, Mary?
For Chatelet, is the virtual things that might happen, so things that are not extraordinary, so gas and water and ice, they relate. But for Deleuze, is the virtual something that's more extraordinary?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, again, I might be at my limits, but Deleuze, for instance, is quite Bergsonian. So we know that there's the cone that Bergson has of memory, and the virtual would be like the past, and then all possible pasts. Or even Bergson says, you're going to go to the shops later, so that your future would be going to the shops, but you've also been to the shops in the past. So there's a much more kind of time element to the virtual for Deleuze, which is also why I think he's critical of Peirce. But Chatelet's just dealing with in the very early bit of the book, which I was referencing to, he's just interested in mass and stuff, I think. But yeah. But anyway, Dean, do you want to?
Oh yeah, okay. So, are you seeing that?
Yeah.
It's a little man. So this is a diagram by Ampere, and in the final chapter of Chatelet's book, which is the only chapter I've read apart from the introduction. It's quite hard going, especially if you don't actually know the the history of kind of the development of physical theories and so on. But it's all about the development of electromagnetism, and he kind of begins by with this kind of problem of magnetism being thought in terms of a length, in terms of either side of a magnet, or the poles on Earth as being this kind of north-south, which are kind of connected through a line. So how to introduce a spatiality, how to spatialize it, and this is what happened through the development of various kind of famous figures of the theory of electromagnetism. And he talks about it's interesting, the book, because it's full of diagrams, but the diagrams are all kind of homogenized to. And it's never quite clear because he's so interested. He's so into the actual discussion. He's so into the head and even the kind of, this, I would call that the kind of virtual space of creating something through mathematics and through what he calls kind of analogical devices, which might actually be kind of experiments and so on. So you've got analogical devices. A little kind of laboratory setup or something. And then you've got thought experiments, and then you've got the mathematics, and you bring them all together. And the diagram kind of fits into that in terms of being able to kind of capture these gestures which are created by these combination of things. So how to talk, how does space start palpitating is the kind of the way he kind of describes it. It starts palpitating with this kind of electromagnetic energy. And one of the key figures obviously is kind of Ampere. And Ampere actually, I found this, there's no reference to it in Châtelet apart from his description, but he talks about a little man on this kind of sphere. And you see what Ampere does here is he's got the north and the south pole, but he's got the electric current, the voltage going right up from his feet to his head. And then he's pointing to the left, or is it to the right? I can't remember which way around he is, but whichever way he's pointing, that's the way that the magnetic field is turning. And then Faraday later turns this little figure into a corkscrew, and it's still used in kind of physics education apparently to describe the kind of orientation of these different forces, or this two elements of this single force kind of acting. But I love this little hand-drawn thing, which was, I think it was in a letter to someone, where he's doing exactly, in a diagram, he's doing exactly what Châtelet is describing, which is you don't have this kind of you neither have a kind of Cartesian overview or kind of synoptic view of a kind of a rational grid, and at the same time you want to kind of transcend the kind of Newtonian laws of ideas of this interaction at a distance and the vacuum, right, and also time being reversible and so on. So I think this little diagram, it does exactly what he's doing, which is actually he's projected himself through kind of in having to think through a kind of theory and come to some kind of understanding and a breakthrough. He's literally kind of, through this diagram, projected his own body into this completely new space, which is actually a much more accurate way of describing what's going on than thinking about magnetism as going along a line, like a ruler or something. So yeah, I just interjected at that point, and
I could show some more diagrams which relates to this action at a distance problem.
I wouldn't mind going back to an earlier diagram, but no, whatever you feel like.
No, John, say what you.
Okay, you had a diagram at the beginning, and it really struck me as you were talking. It's a very early diagram of from Latham, of this timeline and this wavy line. It's if you go, yeah.
Oh, wrong way.
Yeah. Next, that's one. No, next one. No, oh yeah, I think that was the one. Is that the one? Is that the one that you said you couldn't decipher with the 1 to 101?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to say that when you showed that, I had a flash, and this may or may not be relevant, but it's that when I first met the philosopher Nick Land, he was doing a diagram which was very similar to this. And what he was trying to map was the coincidence of two different kind of temporal graphs. And the first was Kondratiev waves, which are the Soviet economists who said that there were these business cycles of 52 years, which coincided with developments in technology. So there were these 52-year cycles. And Terence McKenna's concept of time wave zero, which is, a concept of human consciousness moving towards some culmination point that he said would happen in 2012. And Nick was trying to correlate those two temporal historical lines and the convergence point. So why was it 2012 that this would happen? And for that to happen, the Kondratiev waves weren't equal. So this idea of they were asymptotic. So they were getting sharper. So the technology consciousness thing was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually, by 2012, it would reach, what he called the coming singularity back then. The techno singularity would happen in 2012. But the interesting point that reminds me of Latham and this diagram was that Nick was preoccupied with whether or not it happened at like midnight on the 12th, the 1st of November, the 1st of January, or the 31st of December. And it was literally getting down to the minuscule micro point of what side of this temporal calendrical thing would the happen, But it's to do with this micro calculation within a larger framework for this minuscule event, which actually, from a cosmic perspective, is a mega event. So I just wanted to mention that was reminded of this kind of temporal thinking.
That's very Latham, isn't it? I mean, it's the kind of thing that Latham would do, is to try to find a pattern between between economics and physics or something. Try to plot some kind of correspondence between them.
I mean, he was continually doing that, really. In a way, it seems that he was continually trying to map these complex and different systems and find the synchronicities. Is that the right word? It's probably not quite right. But so I just wanted to mention this thing about the micro event or the least event and how it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It's a bit, what do you call it? What's the paradox? Zeno's paradox, I suppose, is what it's quite close to. Is how close can you get to the event?
That might be something different, but I think the question is like, can you predict these things? So that goes back to that could be a sort of question, as I understand it, in science, where so Lee Smolin, who's an astrophysicist, who was kind of on the space side of things, or he's famous for the kind of loop quantum gravity theory. Who I've mentioned before, he would say there is no future. It hasn't happened. He just thinks that there are events all the way down, he says, which I guess is like a reference to the turtles that are holding up the universe. And that the future isn't written. It's kind of difficult to get your head around, but he would say that there are just a series of moments. I've no idea what these moments are, and your moment would be different from my moment. But he said that what's important in this is that if there isn't time in that sense, there's no novelty and there's no agency. So what I was wondering, because there's the other, I've got some things to explain that problem, which is because Latham didn't like gravity waves or gravitons, and that the basic problem of that is if there are gravitons, that means that there's space, at the quantum level, which he didn't believe, because in his theory, space happens after the least event. But in maybe this is the way I've understood it. This is by Faye Dorker. So she would say that this is her life, and the blue is her being born, and the green is her death. So we experience that as a timeline and as a flow, but actually it's just a block. And Kip Thorne, the astrophysicist who's been responsible for LIGO or collaborated on LIGO, he says that, basically we have this illusion of time and events. But he says the universe is like a book. So we hold a book in our hands and it's all there. We read it and it's like a flow of time. But actually, it's an analogy. And there are reasons for that we all know. But if that's true, then what Nick Land is saying, it's possible to work it out.
Yeah.
But if Smollin's right, and I suspect this is what Latham thought as well. That's right. I just got two more things to say. If Latham is right, then there are kind of events which are unwritten, and what might make that stand up in my naive amateurish understanding is that Latham thinks the universe is cyclical, or events are like they happen and then go back to zero, and then there's another event. So Penrose, who just won the Nobel Prize, has been working on this and actually thinks that our current universe is an eon, and there was one before it and there was one after it, and there's a kind of pattern of photons that might maybe cross into the next eon that creates gravity of some kind. And it could mean that universe is slightly different. I don't know, but that's a kind of interesting question that Latham sets up. And I'll just throw into this as well that Latham's plane of assertion is not static as well. The 0, 1, 0, the 0, 1, 1, 0 and the A to Z means that in his diagram, different parts of the diagram are materially different, which is why I think he used the glass and the paper. So there are kind of two problems there that I was interested in. I made this Mobius strip thing, which is a complete loop, and we know that Mobius strips only have one side. And I guess this explains the whole idea of the kind of universe as one object, which if that Kip Thorne model is right, then Latham is possibly wrong, I guess.
Cool. I just wanted to say a couple of things, quickly, just to, at that time when Nick was formulating the Time Wave 0 2012 thing, he was saying that one of the things he was saying that was freaking a lot of people out was that the future had already happened and it was communicating to us from the future. So actually we were going backwards in time, in fact. It's like the angel of history. We were flowing towards an event which had already happened. So the future had already happened. We were moving towards it, being sucked into it So he reversed the whole sense of time as something which has direction towards some positive goal, as something which has been sucked into a hole. So we're actually experiencing something unraveling backwards forwards in time, but towards an event that happened. But that was what he was thinking back in the early 90s, and I don't know what he thinks now. So, but what I was really struck by the quantum space diagram, it's just purely left field again. It's not is how much it reminded me of palmistry, and the way in which there are lines on our hands. You had the death line, the life line, the intersection. And palmistry presumably is also based on some sense of where are you on the palmistry timeline? Is everything predestined, or rather, is there freedom in that map? of your predestined intersections of different parts of your life. So I was just reminded of palmistry.
No, that's right. That's right, and that is the spatial metaphor of time. So that diagram. I don't know if you can go back to it, David.
Which one?
The one who was talking about her death and her birth and how.
Oh, okay.
That's what you were talking about, John, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Is it this one?
That's the one.
Yeah. So it's like, although she's trying to get us to think differently about time, this is a pure timeline. There's past and there's future, and you move up it, and if you want, you can move back down it and go backwards and go back in time. But it is a timeline. So I don't know how. The question is, would it be possible to represent time as not a line, if that's the purpose of the, explaining the theory?
Instead of a line, though, I think we're meant to imagine it as Latham might see it, as a structure of events. So Faye Dorker talks. But it is a timeline. So could you do the structure of events without this timeline? Faye Dorker argues you can, and says that children do it. So children know that they have to do something in a certain order, which is like brush their teeth, say goodnight. Or sometimes they might do it sometimes. Well, there you go. The theory collapses when you come.
Yeah, I'm not sure. but order is really important. I mean, order is really, really important.
But she suggests that they can grasp
growing
that,
up. Yeah,
and then they can kind of kick against that. But they find telling the time harder. The idea of like, okay, you're going to go somewhere in 7 days' time at 2:00. Is that kind of timeline thing is harder to grasp.
You have to be quite old. You're already quite old before you can grasp that idea, I think.
So I don't know if this stands up, but it's an interesting idea. She's saying, like if children have the right idea, which is, there's a structure of events rather than a timeline. And Kip Thorne would just say, it's our reading the book.
Yeah,
that we experience a flow, but actually that's just because we're kind of built that way, or our experience. But
a book is another classic spatial metaphor for time. Our life is a book. It's
but it's the idea of the block, really, of the block brain, which Kip Thorne is a brilliant Nobel Prize winning scientist, but he also helped Christopher Nolan create Interstellar, and he used this kind of analogy of flatlands, that idea of different dimensions, and suggests that there's a higher bulk dimension in which all the dimensions, including time, are in, and that if you're one of those higher bulk beings, like there is in the film, that Tesseract, you will just see everything at the same time. There will be no timeline. You will just see this block.
I mean, what Ravelli says, I think, in his book on time, Ravelli, who works with Smolin on the gravity loop theory. Quantum loop. Was it quantum loop gravity?
Quantum loop gravity. It put those words in the right order.
Yeah.
I can never remember which way they go, but yeah.
Is that really time is a kind of effect of memory, right? It's the effect of traces. It's almost kind of Freudian the way he describes time, because time is literally just the little traces that we have of events that happened, and the traces of those events makes us perceive time as something real. Whereas it's absolutely true, for a small child, they just don't think of time in that way, and it's very strange to try to communicate with them about, you know, what's happening in an hour or something. But
it's like whether things are event structured. So the singularity of AI, I guess, would be an event. But I remember Gareth saying, you know, Latham works with the coal board, and a good result would be that they start in 1970, whatever. They think about wind turbines and alternative power. That suggests to me that Latham thinks that the future isn't written, whereas there is this other model which is really seductive and possibly true, and the standard model of science, I think, is this, that at least at the level of the laws of the universe that govern kind of particles and black holes, the future is written. You can kind of see now that parts of the universe, like black holes, are coming together, and that we're in the exciting bit where it's more kind of spread out. I could explain this a bit, but if anyone wants to,
I just want to say, I think it's a really important insight, David, that, you know, like, you know, just that, you know, anti-determinism seems to be something that Latham, you know, the whole idea of the artist placement group, that an artist could be put in industry or some other sector, and that they, by doing art, they are doing something to transform the time bases. It seems to me that Latham was aware, and I'm not familiar with the extent to which he was ecologically conscious about global warming or catastrophism or whatever, but it seems to me that there must have been something about that the rigid logic of deterministic materialism and science was wrong, and there was an opening, and unless we recognise that, I mean, I don't know if there's an anti-catastrophism, but these days you would certainly see that there's a logic which is ruining things, which is pursuing things in a certain way. And if we can open up consciousness to a greater scale of time, that somehow we can do something about that. But without that opening, you know, we're in trouble.
Yeah, I guess this is why I was wondering whether 01-10 is like a sigil, because a sigil is something where you write, like a modern sigil is where you write a desire down, get rid of all the vowels, use all the constants to make an image, and then you kind of burn it in on your brain unconsciously. You're affected by that. The 0110 isn't quite like that, but it's this kind of figure that's a diagram, which if you unfold it, all of his ideas about this event structure are contained within it. But it's like a kind of thing that's immediate there, and it's like a flash in terms of an image, which you know, maybe kind of communicates that idea to you. But it also seems a lot of his terms get taken up by the artist placement group and sort of function in that way as a kind of to create this kind of community with these principles in some way.
He says something in relation to APG, which is maybe relevant to John's point. So he's got this question about, he calls it the problem of motivation in post-capitalist societies, which is I guess it's something that various people have kind of grappled with. You know, what's going to happen to everyone when they don't have to, you know, get out of bed in the morning and go to their job, you know, to pay the rent or something. Well, we're going to, you know, end up in some terribly kind of terrible state of entropy or something. But he talks about devising a stratagem to facilitate public determination in regard to their future. So there is a kind of question of a future being a kind of human created future, which seems to be to do with the public imagination, and this seems to me what the vital role of artists, probably as opposed to the vital role of scientists, is in society for for Latham, that they can kind of tap into something kind of motivating in terms of a future, right? A future which looks different from the present.
Yeah.
And I suppose as well, just to quickly note on that period from the late 60s through the 70s was a period when there was that idealism of the 3-day week. There was still the idea that automation and robotics would transform the world of work, and what our problem would be leisure time, which is, I think, linked to the idea of post-capitalist work.
Well, that was a Labour Party manifesto, basically, wasn't it? But nobody voted for it, or not enough people.
So yeah, I just mentioned that in the sense of the kind of idealism that there might be a world where people didn't have to work as much as they do.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's interesting to me reading physics as someone who can't claim to properly understand it, but I kind of thought, oh yeah, this idea of space is fundamental and the future is written. I kind of thought, yeah, that's right. But then, for various reasons, but also in terms of like for the sake of agency, you have to have time. I mean, I've got an image that I thought would interest Mary, I think, which is kind of relates to this, which is so you were very interested in the time, what's it called? The
time-based roller.
Time-based roller.
Yeah.
But you might have to say what that is, I guess, because I haven't got an image of it.
Yeah, it's a kinetic artwork where he has rolled up a sheet of canvas on a roller, and you only see the front of the painting when it's in front of the roller. So the painting is facing away from the audience, and you only get to see a tiny section of this timeline when it's round the roller. Yeah, so is this another... This is from Wheeler.
Yeah, so like it's quite interesting. Like this is a diagram which in the top, it explains in the text that he's trying to think of the universe as a sphere, but then he's got this idea of the universe unrolled, which kind of was just an association. But then the circles is basically the small circles at top and bottom are the beginning and the end of the universe, or the Big Bang and the Big Whimper, if that's how you see it. Although there's evidence that might not be the case, but or not evidence, but theories that it might be the case. But I guess the question is, in relation to the time roller, we won't. I know you're going to talk about it, Mary. We won't go into it too much, but it seems that in the Latham diagram, the future isn't unwritten, but there is a kind of moment in it where there's space and there's there's this Wheeler's diagram of the self-excited universe, i.e. humans appear in the cosmos and they look back and can see the beginning of like background radiation and beginnings of the universe. And that's in Latham's diagram, isn't it? It's in the roller blind, as I understand it, and it's even down to the fact that there's an armchair next to it. And so that's something else that's interesting with Latham, and it comes back to that, like, what is the plane of assertion? Because there's a point in the diagram which is also Latham outside of the diagram, which is this intuitive person, or this thing that Wheeler drew. He read Wheeler. I think he got a lot from Wheeler, but wasn't satisfied with Wheeler saying, it's all, there's this kind of chaos created by quantum theory.
So Latham had a circular notion of time, so 1001, but I wonder what he would have thought about the position of the intuitive artist, or the intuitive being who has through their knowledge of time bases, they have a intuitive understanding of bigger chunks of time. So maybe they would be more interested in ecological events that could happen in 1,000 times, in 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years. So where would all that relate to this notion of that the future is written and we're just being sucked into it, as John was saying? I would have thought that Latham would not be favourable of that notion that time is written.
That's a good question. So I don't know if I've got this right, but that is a good question. So I think the cyclical nature of things is just that something starts as 0, becomes 1, least event, there's extension, there's the impulse and the discharge, and then something goes back to 0. So I think it's cyclical in that there's nothing, something happens, and then you go back to nothing. So I get I don't know enough really, because it's been such a short time doing the research, but John does. But I'm just going to say, I'm guessing Latham thinks that within 1-to-1, you know, there are events, and at the level, not at the quantum maybe, but at the level of human culture and things, you could change things. And Smolin suggests that the laws of evolution, Smolin, the astrophysicist who believes in time and thinks all this kind of space thing is rubbish, suggests that the laws of the universe, of physics, evolve. They're not set at 0. So
this is very similar to Peirce. I mean, I looked up that Smolin's guy, and he's got a whole theory about cosmic evolution, right? And this is so similar to Peirce, what Peirce is writing about. Peirce calls it evolutionary love. Evolutionary love is the kind of thirdness, the kind of final stage of a kind of process of kind of evolution, which would involve kind of variation as a kind of firstness, then mechanical necessity as the secondness, then creative love. This is to do with kind of creativity. But I mean, Peirce's kind of cosmic theory, which is in this essay he writes, Evolutionary Love, which is kind of bonkers, because it's a kind of theory of everything, really, including logic and language, biology, physiology, psychology, and the physical laws of the universe. But he brings it all together. He kind of synchronizes it with this notion of evolution. You know, this is what it's really about. There's a kind of development, and again, he ends up in a situation very similar to that Wheeler diagram, where, and it's quite Hegelian, and he says it is kind of coming from Hegel and Schlegel, really. Schlegel, yeah. Hegel and Schlegel, is that right?
Yeah, it's like a comic. It should be a cartoon. We should do it.
Yeah, no, it's funny because that's.
I'm not going to do the words. I'll do the pictures, but I can't do the words.
Yeah, but it's a kind of idealism, I guess, where you know eventually the universe is it's a kind of anthropic principle, I guess, but it's where the universe is, gets to a stage of development, having evolved over so many billion years, and all the kind of whatever moments of order that have been created through various molecules forming in the stars and so on, and then life coming about, and eventually you get to a point where there's a kind of human consciousness that is able to look and understand the beginnings, right? So that's where it kind of ends up, just like that diagram.
Yeah, I know John wanted to say something, but
that's well, I should just say, a couple of things. But firstly, I think that's absolutely right and absolutely essential. And anyway, I'll try to talk about it when I do my thing, but I don't know if I'll be able to. But that Wheeler diagram of the I, which sees itself, is precisely that, right? Like the consciousness starts with the little arrow, goes down, gets wider and wider till there's a certain point where something evolves in the universe called human consciousness, which is able to figure out how the universe came into existence. Right? That's, a slow process. They thought it was God at first, and they realized it's just matter, whatever. But that does suggest that there's a moment. It's not quite the right word for it, but cosmic consciousness or cosmological consciousness seems to be something that happened, is an event. We humans have achieved some sort of consciousness of how the universe was created, etc., etc. And I won't go too far into that, but that's very what Alfred Korzybski's structural differential, which I might talk about, is designed to show, that the loops, it always goes back to itself. It's almost exactly like the Penrose diagram. But David, there was one thing I wanted to just say. I'm sorry, Dean, I know there's lots of other things, but as you flashed through your images, I saw the Escher image, which is one of the three diagrams, ways of representing the theories of cosmic compression after expansion. And I was wondering if that is in any way what Latham's, I think it's the one with the angels, isn't it? But it could be that one, or it could be, but is what Latham's piece that you talked about with the sand and the circle and the elements, is that, I just saw a correlation between the piece you talked about and these diagrams.
My first response would be no, but it might be. But the reason that this is in here, I guess, is because if there was time, I wanted to look at Roger Penrose, who we should celebrate for winning the Nobel Prize.
And we should celebrate his overhead projector diagrams.
They're amazing, aren't they?
It's so fantastic, so inspiring, actually.
Yeah, this is his. So I'll run through this because this is the only way I know how to do it to kind of build in the Escher bit. But so this is his picture of the Big Bang and the universe, and he's not happy about the idea of cosmic inflation, which is to explain how the universe kind of grows, whatever. And also he's not happy with it because it doesn't explain how gravity comes about, as I understand it. That's what he says. So, and I guess it means he's not kind of happy with the idea that it's just this Big Bang, that before it there's nothing, no time, no space. So his problem also seems to be that his intuition is that there's a cycle, and that before the Big Bang there's a universe, and after the end of our universe supposedly there's another universe, and he needs to show that the beginning and the end is the same. And he does it, I don't properly understand it, but he does it through conformal geography. So that's his diagram of trying to explain how the beginning and the end, if we can call it that, is the same.
So they just say it reminds me of the ends of the roller, in a way. By creating a roller rather than a cone, you have the two ends that are the same, but they're related. But I wonder if that actually, just to put that on there.
No, that's absolutely right. Because it's the same all the way down.
It just goes round and round forever.
Yeah. He says that, and maybe each time you pull it up and down, it should change, but it doesn't, I guess.
Well, each time is a different event, because the two zeros at each end, if you like, you could see that if you put the ends of the rollers as zeros and the ones at the beginning, the roller is in between the two ones. So every time anything happens in that it's happening as an event in time. But the far ends of the roller are sort of linked in Penrose way, but that's just totally wild speculation.
Yeah, so I mean, the roller is a bit like an analogical device, what Chatelet would call an analogical device to to kind of picture something.
I think Penrose is a great performer, and he takes his Big Bang diagram and he turns it upside down, and then he takes the Big Crunch, which is basically the end of the universe, is when all the black holes start moving towards each other and collapsing into each other to make one big black hole, and he calls that's known as the Big Crunch. Even Wheeler uses that, so I don't know, but I think it's a term that goes back even to Wheeler. So that Big Crunch is basically all the black holes, and he just says it's a mess. But then what happens is that black holes which are cold become slightly warmer than the surrounding universe, because there's nothing there, and and as I understand it, then you have heat entropy, and you have Hawking's notion of radiation leaking from the black hole. So all you end up with is protons, which have no mass.
Photons,
yeah. So he kind of puts the Big Crunch on the Big Bang, and so I think the conformal geometry is his way of creating an image to think about this. So we know I think we mentioned this before when we met before, that Penrose knew Escher and was really interested in what Escher was doing. And there's also this diagram object that Penrose talks about, which is this impossible triangle in which it just seems to move backwards and forwards. So I guess it's trying to create in the mind this idea of something that seems the beginning of the end, or close or far away, being the same thing.
The triangle, just to is quite interesting. I heard an interview with Penrose, and Escher uses this triangle, but it was given to him by Penrose, and worked out between him and his father, because his father was a mathematician. I mean, the whole family are kind of scientists and mathematicians and chess grandmasters and that. So he'd kind of gone to some kind of conference when he was an undergraduate, and they'd had an Escher exhibition, because they thought all the scientists would be into Escher, which of course they are, all the mathematicians.
Yeah.
And then Penrose kind of formulated this with his father and sent it to Escher, who started using it in some of his famous works.
I wonder what Latham would have thought of Escher.
Well, artists are very snobby about Escher, aren't they? Kind of him and
But I mean, that's what. But what I was referring to, Dean, I don't know if I made is that the earlier sculpture by Latham, which there's only a segment of, which is the sand and was that I was wondering if that isn't if there isn't a correlation between that diagram, that model, that the NU Nidri heart isn't. Do you think that has anything to do with that?
I think the thing about that conformal geometry is that the shapes throughout remain the same in like all the ratio of all the.
Yeah, it's kind of like a fractal, isn't it?
Yeah, but what interests Penrose is that even though they're the same, they obviously disappear towards a kind of horizon for Chatelet, which creates a kind of a limit. So it's there is, I don't quite understand it, because there is nothing infinite in nature as I understand it, but it's the idea that there's a kind of infinite progression which is a limit rather than going on forever, which I think is related to the end of the universe or the beginning in some way. But I'm not clever enough to really.
No, but the quote on your slide, Latham suggests that any degree of permanence is due to an ever-present, universal, recurrent event, rather than continuity as the physical object or thing. So, permanence is the recurrence of an ever-present, universal, recurrent event. I know it's not the same. I'm just trying to work that out in my head as I read it. I'm not.
I don't think it's the same, because I think for Latham this is a loop and not a conformal piece of geometry. But I thought, Mary, you might be interested in this when you come to talk about scores, because it's written about as a as if Latham thinks of the whole. I mean, you already know this because you said it to us.
As a musical score.
Yeah. So this is a kind of score in a way, I guess. But I'll just go back to Latham to Penrose, because there's a really interesting, amazing thing which works on paper, but I've no idea whether it's real in terms of science. So what he says, this is fun. Well, I won't do this. That's Wheeler's black hole, and that's Penrose's black hole. What he says is, if you take account of entropy and you think about it in relation to the universe, you can have two states, seemingly two different states being the same, i.e. you can have minimum and maximum entropy being kind of the same. So what's really interesting is if you put entropy into the archive of Flat Time House, nothing comes up. So either nobody's read the archive to index it, but they have indexed gravity, and we know that like gravity anxiety is too strong a word, but if unfortunately the graviton has been discovered, and Latham said that's it, that's the end of my story, but there's lots of stuff about gravity, nothing about entropy. But if you introduced entropy into Latham's 0110 and the strip, it actually could work in the way Penrose says, perhaps, because he says our idea of entropy, so like he uses the idea of gas in a box, which is like in the top left box you've got like a clump of particles or whatever they are, and then the gas spreads in the box. When the gas is completely spread out and mixed with the other gases in the box, that's maximum entropy. And that's like the heat, the notion of heat entropy, in which like the kind of hot dissipates to, or spreads and gives energy to the cool, as I understand it. I probably got it all wrong, but it doesn't go the other way, basically. So in terms of heat entropy, or the gas in a box, where everything's completely spread out, that's maximum entropy. And that's kind of like the beginning of the universe. But in gravity, everything spread out is minimum entropy. Maximum entropy is a black hole that's collapsed. So it's a kind of, I think, he's obviously a clever man, so I'm not going to say it's a trick, but it's, in terms of putting the thought in my head, it's quite brilliant. And he does this thing where he lays the pen on the overhead projector so that you can see the gravity minimum entropy against the maximum gas or heat entropy. And the purpose of doing this, which I kind of, if you remember, like this is that's the 01-10. Between 1 and 1 is the universe. Around here, the reflective intuitive organism is actually Wheeler's U with an eye on it, everything that you were all talking about. And if you put Penrose's black hole here, you can kind of see what, we've got like, and you can index it to the 0, 1, 1, 1, 0. And if you have heat entropy and gravity entropy running along the top and the bottom, if you follow the gravity entropy, this is where the universe begins to create space, I guess, or there's gravity and planets are made and humans are formed and whatever. You end up with this maximum entropy where everything goes to the big crunch, I guess, where the black holes all come together, and there's images of the universe going away from us using blue and red shift, which shows that that's actually happening, that there are these bigger clumps appearing. But then if at this point, if you introduce the heat entropy, because the black hole becomes slightly hotter than the universe around it, it begins to leak radiation and photons. You get the heat entropy situation where you get this maximum entropy, which is like the 0, 1, the least event, the proton, the proto-universe that you get in Latham's diagrams. And I guess what you get with the Z in Latham is some event in the future that's undetermined, we don't know what it is. With Penrose, you get this idea of the Big Crunch being the beginning of the Big Bang. So there's a kind of looping, and I guess the question is whether in that looping every loop is different, or with Smolin you get the kind of idea that the universe kind of develops and its laws develop as it develops, and then maybe there will be a different set of laws for the next universe because it's slightly different, or perhaps it's exactly the same, and then in every universe Nick Land can say in 2012 at 12 o'clock AI is born. I mean, in terms of practical, like dealing with COVID, giving people jobs, I guess it's very kind of academic, but I think what's interesting is about this kind of lack of this idea of determinism or not, which it certainly had done its job on me, Latham's introducing this idea.
What I find interesting is what you've done. I guess this, like what you've done with this sigil, as you call it, is you've stretched it from the way Latham defines it, which is the least event, which is the, as I understand, is it the Planck constant? Is that what you call it? It's the time. It's some kind of minimum time that something takes to cross an electron, or an electron takes to cross something.
I think the least event. So I don't know enough, but I think the least event is not the same as the Planck constant, because Planck gives us the smallest things that can be measured.
Yes,
but I guess Latham doesn't. Maybe he does, but what Latham actually says it's a proton. But you know that you can break
a photon.
A photon, sorry, not a proton. I've even put proton.
It's a time a photon takes to cross an
Freudian
electron.
slip there. There's not proton.
Very Freudian. And it's not Schlegel, it's Schelling.
Yeah. Sorry, so that's a spelling which I have to correct and Photoshop in. But I guess a photon can be broken down. the lowest or the
well, at
quantum
least
loop gravity suggests that there's quarks and gluons, and
there's at least a point. I took a note of it where Latham describes this 011, this sigil, as you call it, as the diagrammatic form of this least event, right? So it seemed, and maybe I got that wrong, but it seems to me that's what he says at some point.
The 0 and the 1. He says between 0 and 1 is between the quantum and I guess the photon.
Exactly. So what you've done is you've managed to stretch the least time interval into the kind of largest kind of dimension that we can imagine, which is the coming into being of the and collapse of the universe, of our universe. So the
bit between 1 and 1 is the universe, I guess.
I mean, it's an interesting, because another way to read it is not as nothing and one, but as a kind of binary, like a computer.
On off,
and he describes it as an impulse and a discharge. So it's actually a switch. It's a kind of basic switch. It's a basic level of secondness, as Peirce would, in Peirce's terms. It's action and reaction or something, on off. It's binary code. It's what computation it consists of, and it's not. So it's not. It can't be spatialized in that sense. It's probably more like Peirce's diagrams. But you've turned it into this. You've stretched it and turned it into an enormous timeline.
Well, he does that really. It's a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So the 0 to 1, the least event, it's not into scale. That's not a universe. But the 1 to 1, as I understand it, the H is the universe. And that's when space is kind of born, if you like. And then there's the 1 to 0, I'm suggesting, is the bit like I've drawn inside the universe on the Penrose level his idea of a black hole, and he says that the evaporation, there's a kind of pop of a black hole. He said he called it a pop rather than a bang because it's cosmologically it's not big, or not as big as a big bang, and then all the radiation disperses. So it's kind of in between U and M that all the action happens, or between 1 and 1. So I don't think I've personally stretched it out. I think it's what Latham has done. But the interesting thing I was going to say earlier was when you were speaking, Dean, about Peirce, is that Lee Smolin, in suggesting that there's only moments, he suggests that you need a new ontology for physics, where you're not trying to work out what things are in their substance. He said there's a question of like, where does stuff come from? What is it? Which he sort of implies science won't be able to answer. He's suggesting all that you can do is understand things in their relation to each other, which is very much like you were saying, it's very Peircean.
Yeah.
But he also says that in entanglement, space disappears. So like how you measure one particle from a particle that is meant to be a long way away affects this other particle, this kind of entanglement effect.
Spooky action, or is that the same as spooky action?
Yeah, and it's spooky because nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, which is why Newton is wrong. So maybe there are kind of different hierarchies that we have to understand. So I think he says something like, something is identical, or something can be counted as something through its relation. So a water molecule in where I'm living and a water molecule where you're all living all have the same relation, maybe, to I don't know, something else, like some other molecule. So he maybe at that level there is, there's no space, and that the relation is very different at another kind of hierarchical level. And he goes into all of that. He talks about economics, and like Latham, he wanted a more kind of inclusive science, which he thinks that the relation of things, or trying to have an ontology of relation rather than what something is the way forward. Unfortunately, there's like I don't think I've ever seen a Lee-Smolin diagram. There are lots of equations which I can't read, but which is kind of curious. But I think the Latham is the same thing. Maybe it's not about like what something is, because he thinks just things are structures of events. There's no thing that's me, unless you understand that as a structure of events. But the relations are what then becomes important, I think, and maybe the relations are in time rather than space, which is something I kind of thought the opposite of.
Well, it's also
but Latham maybe diagrams.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean that's Peirce's definition of a diagram, isn't it? It's an icon of relations.
Yeah.
So maybe, although there's a critique of there's a critique that you mentioned, Chatelet's critique of Peirce. Maybe he's onto something by this icon of relations, which is not describing any kind of physical space actually, but is simply describing the way things, the kind of bare bones of a kind of substance or an object. It simply in terms of its kind of the relations, it's kind of skeletal relations.
You could say that the plane of assertion in Peirce and most diagrams is taken for granted, and it's not seen as Latham sees it, perhaps, or allows it to be a kind of structure of events. But whether Latham can do the work that Peirce does is also a question, because there's a certain kind of forgetting and clearing in the diagram of Peirce, which is not in Latham, because in Latham, I guess, we have to think that the clearing is full of the quantum, and it's a kind of not a space, but it's seen in terms of time. But I'm not sure you can do the work, even that Smolin wants. Like Penrose's diagrams are basically kind of pictures and cartoons and drawings that communicate thoughts, and they need to take the background for granted.
I mean, interestingly, Penrose says he wasn't that good at maths, and he was very slow. He's very slow, kind of. He can do it. He actually is very good at it, but he was just very slow. And it does seem to me that this is a way for him to kind of think his way into these problems, the actual drawing, which is why he draws it, and he has this beautiful style where he kind of, he has this shading, doesn't he, where he draws these kind of abstract shapes, and they're timelines. I mean, they're pure timelines, but they're about a kind of exponential growth of the universe, including space and time. But he kind of shades them in, so they become like three-dimensional objects that we can somehow relate to. They become kind of more graspable or something, I
mean, I would say, like, making the Peirce diagram and the Chatelet one, and then doing these test strips, although it's full of spelling mistakes and it's like a bit
brilliant. I love it.
a bit embarrassing to put them out there. I think there's something in doing them where you're like, the thing that Latham made me do is like think, what is the plane of assertion here? You know, like here is the space where is a planet, and over here there isn't. So that was the first thing that I think Latham makes me really aware of the ground, and then the least event. But the other thing is, it's just you sort of think through the ideas through the drawing, and I can't say I totally understand the purse or I totally got it right, but that's interesting to me, because you start to say, oh, it could be this or it could be that. I guess the difference between that approach and the approach that Kip Thorne takes now, who's the guy who said like the universe is like a book and it's all there, is that they're using computer modeling, because there's no time. You're just modeling the universe. You're just going to get this block. So thought is totally in a totally different relation, which is the difference between reading a book, I guess, in time, like you were saying about the purse diagrams, and having something presented to you as a kind of block, which maybe, it'll take time to read, but it itself is not made in time in the same way because it's done through a computer. I'm not a technophobe, and I really think that that you need those computer simulations because humans can't do them. But there's something really interesting about the kind of analog diagram for the human mind and the imaginary in some way. And Latham as an artist, because he knows, Rauschenberg and the ground and abstract expressionism. As we'd all say, I think he understands the plane of assertion as an artist, which has complicated things. I see that as a kind of challenge then to can you make a diagram where the plane of assertion is a kind of looped into the real world, or where you are is in that plane of assertion, but also as a material thing in the world, which I think is what he does.